All right, so let's go ahead and get started on layer number 1. Like I said, this is similar to a pastry crust and similar to the technique that you use when you are making scones to cut in the butter. So we're gonna start off with 4 tablespoons of cold butter. So I just took this out of the fridge and I'm going to go ahead and break them apart and distribute them about. If you have a pastry blender, great. It'll be really easy. You just go ahead and use it to cut the pieces apart and break them into tiny little pieces, right? If you do not have a pastry blender, then you have other options as well. So if you don't have a pastry blender, option number 1, let me get all this butter out of here, is to use 2 knives and pull them in separate directions to legitimately cut up the little pieces of butter. And this takes a little bit longer, but it's just as effective. So it cuts it into small pea-sized shapes, and you're gonna evenly distribute them throughout. So you can keep doing that. And if you don't wanna do the 2-knife method, you can use the back of a fork. And you can use the back of a fork, it's not as easy as it looks, just as like a pastry blender and to kind of smash it. I don't like the back of the fork method as much because it kind of flattens the butter and doesn't turn it into small pieces. Yep, that's my kid. So anyways, so just keep going until all the butter is cut into small pieces that are similar to pebbles. And then we'll be ready to go ahead and we are going to mix in the cold water. So I have ice cold water here and it is sitting in this bowl, and we don't want the ice. So I've had this before in class when we made this in class where students actually mix in water with ice in it. The ice is not for the recipe. The ice is just to keep that water really, really cold. The reason we are using ice water and not tap water or warm water is because we don't want this butter to melt. By preventing the butter from melting, which is why we don't handle it too much, it helps us to create layers. So whenever we have those tiny little particles of fat distributed throughout the dough, it's going to, when it bakes, essentially the butter will melt, create some steam, and we'll get nice little flakes. So I'm going to grab my tablespoon, and we're going to mix in 2 tablespoons of water. And this is where it's going to differ a little bit from pie crust or our biscuits, is that we're trying to make a dough here. So we're gonna mix it together and it's gonna form a shaggy dough. And after it forms that shaggy dough, we're then going to transfer it to our baking sheet and we're gonna wet our hands. You can use the ice water or you can use water from your tap. And we are going to go ahead and turn it into a log. So after you have mixed this all together, you can go ahead and start just squeeze it together. So I have my dough. On your directions, you're on step 3 now. It says to wet your hands and shape the piece of the wet dough into a rough log. Pat the log into a 10 by 3 rectangle on the sheet and leave 2 inches on each side. Since we're only making 1, we don't need to worry about spacing really, but we want to make sure that it's like not directly next to the sides of the oven or the pan, because in the oven it is going to expand. So I'm going to wet my hands and I'm just going to pat this until we get a nice flat dough. Now, with this, I like to kind of shape up the sides as we go. Could you use a pastry blender? Or not a pastry blender, a roller? You could, but that might make it too wide. And we really want it to be long and narrow, not really wide. Notice how I'm using the parchment paper. If you have parchment paper, go for it. It's gonna make the job actually a lot easier as you are shaping. And I like to use the heel of my palm. So I've got some work to do. Just keep working it with your hand to get that nice long log. It's probably closer to 4 inches rather than 3 inches. Devin, will you go grab me a roller, please?
Where that?
I think actually. Okay, so for layer number 2, we're making a choux dough, and that's like a twice baked dough, and we're gonna cook it the first time on the stovetop. Before we go over to the stovetop, let's talk about ingredients. So we have a half of a cup of our water, and we're gonna add to that a pinch of salt. So just a little bit of salt. And what we're gonna start off by doing is we're gonna bring this to a boil, and then we're gonna add the butter. After we add the butter, let that come to a boil, we are going to add in the flour all at once and stir it in. Removing that, we're gonna add the egg one at a time. So we're gonna remove that from the heat, add the eggs one at a time. Well, this is where it gets a little tricky because the recipe calls for 1.5 eggs. So here I have 1 egg already mise en place in its container, and then I have another egg. So it doesn't call for 2 eggs, it calls for 1.5. Well, how do we determine that, right? Well, because this recipe originally called for 3 and I cut it in half, we're gonna have to cut this egg in half. Well, we know, you know now that I'm telling you, that there are 3 tablespoons of liquid in 1 egg. If I just took half of the egg, say the egg white, and put it in here, would it be close to 1.5 tablespoons? Probably. But the problem is we're missing out on that rich fat that's found in the yolk. If we took out the yolk and put it in there, but didn't include the egg white, we're missing out on a lot of protein. And we know that the eggs have that protein and that fat in there, and it contributes to the overall structure and texture of the baked good. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna mix it up. So we're gonna start and we're gonna mix this egg until it's fully incorporated. Think making breakfast, so making scrambled eggs. So once it's really well mixed up, we're gonna do our best to measure out about 1.5 tablespoons. One thing that's important is that whenever you're cooking with eggs, you're always using large eggs because recipes are tested using that standard size large egg. So you wanna make sure that you're watching out for jumbo sized eggs or medium eggs, which are also sold in grocery stores. If you have backyard chickens, it's hard to determine how large the size of eggs are unless you have a scale, and then you can weigh them and you can determine. So we have about 1 tablespoon there that I'm gonna add, and then 1/2 tablespoon. So we'll take those out and we'll mix those in whenever we mix the eggs in, okay?
On the stove top right now we have the water, the 4 tablespoons of butter, and the pinch of salt coming to a boil. And we're gonna start really quickly, and then we are going to add all the flour all at once. So we're gonna stir that really well. And we are going to cook it down just until everything's absorbed. We're going to cook that for about 30 seconds over the top until it moves from the sides, and you can see that it's doing that. And then we're going to take it over and we're going to transfer it to a bowl.
Okay, so after you have transferred it away from the stove, go ahead and pour it into a bowl. And I'm stirring it right now for about 30 seconds to a minute, just so the steam's starting to come off and that it cools down just a little bit. So you can smell that the dough is cooked, and I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna add the egg one at a time. So remember, we had our whole egg that we're gonna add first, and we're gonna just stir until it's fully mixed in. This is how you would make a traditional choux dough if you were gonna make cream puffs or eclairs. And then we had that 1.5 tablespoons of egg that we will mix in just a second after this is completely mixed in. Okay, that looks perfect. Now we're gonna add that, and then our dough will be ready. So this recipe requires a long and slow bake time. So it cooks for about 45 to 50 minutes. Okay, so now this is perfect. I'm gonna bring my original base layer, whoa, almost lost it there, back over. And I am going to go ahead and I'm going to spread it. Ooh, almost forgot the vanilla. Okay, very last step, add your vanilla. It would have just been a little bit bland. It would have still came out all right, but the flavor would have been lacking there. Okay, so we're gonna mix that in. Perfect, okay, now we're gonna spread it there. This top layer is going to completely cover this. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna use my spoon, the back of a spoon. You could use a little spatula if you had a spatula. You can use wet hands. You can use anything that's going to allow you to completely cover that recipe. Okay, so really that's it. And now it's ready for its bake time. All right, so my oven is preheated to 350. I'm gonna open it up and I wanna make sure actually that, rookie mistake, my rack is in the middle of the oven. So I'm just gonna adjust that really quickly as fast as I can without letting out too much heat. And I'm gonna put my cup loaf in there and I'm gonna make sure I set a timer on my phone or on the oven.